Our presentation is on identifying similarities and differences. Before we start, we want you to think about a strategy that you have used in your classroom to have students compare and contrast or identify similarities and differences about a given topic. Keep this in mind while we explore this instructional strategy. We will come back to it later.
Having students identify similarities and differences is important for all students, but especially ELL students, because it helps them to learn content at a deeper level. It requires them to activate prior knowledge, make new connections, construct meaning, and talk about their reasoning.
The first step is to provide a variety of teacher-directed explicit instruction. This allows students to better use the knowledge they're learning because they receive the knowledge linguistically and non-linguistically. Examples for teaching ELLs how to identify similarities and differences are representing what you say with visuals, use short, simple sentences with clear articulation, include gestures and facial expressions, use high-frequency vocabulary, nouns are better than pronouns, and reduce idiomatic expressions. These strategies align with strategies we have talked about in class.
The next step is to have the students do independent activities. Have students begin with familiar topics to compare, then lead to more content-related comparisons. Comparing familiar items first, because familiar is here and now, forces them to use everyday vocabulary and reduces the cognitive demand. The more talking opportunities that is related to a student's background, the more successful the student will be. Many ELL students don't develop strong academic skills because the instruction often takes place in cognitively demanding context-reduced situations.
When identifying similarities and differences, it is important to represent them in graphic or symbolic forms. Representing similarities and differences in graphic or symbolic form enhances the ability to understand similarities and differences. Visual representation helps make connections and connect meanings. This strategy should accompany both teacher-directed and student-directed activities. And this strategy requires students to use language to explain graphics.
Some classroom recommendations are to use comparing, such as the color, size, shape, function, composition, and parts. And this falls in the pre-production and early production stage for students. Classifying different things, such as classifying them into animals, fruits, occupations, etc. This is also for pre-production and early production students. Creating analogies, such as the thermometer is to blank, as odometer is to blank. This is for speech emergent students, and creating metaphors, which is identifying a basic pattern in a topic and then finding a different topic that follows the same pattern. And this is only to be used for intermediate fluency and advanced fluency students.
Here are some examples of strategies for identifying similarity and differences that can be adapted to each stage of language acquisition. One strategy is to use different methods to identify similarities and differences. Another is model each method. Begin with familiar topic when modeling. Use graphic organizers to represent similarities and differences. And guide ELLs through the process of identifying similarities and differences with faded support.
One example of a strategy that you can use is an attribute chart. For example, if you are having students identify similarities and differences between an apple and an orange, this can be adapted to each stage of language acquisition. For pre-production, students point to a red color swatch and repeat the word red when holding an apple. For early production, students complete sentence starter with one-word response. For example, the apple and orange are the same because For speech emergence, students complete sentence starter with phrase or short sentence. Example, the apple and orange are different because. For intermediate and advanced fluency students, they will not need sentence starters, but responses will need some shaping.
The attribute chart can be gradually increased to include more characteristics, such as the composition of items and parts of the item. Attribute charts allow pre-production students to build vocabulary, early production students to use familiar vocabulary, and speech emergence students to practice using sentences. Intermediate and advanced fluency students are able to work on improving their academic language knowledge by using words other than same and different as they compare items. The next step is to allow students to choose what items they want to compare and which characteristics they are going to compare.
Following the attribute chart would be to have students fill out a Venn diagram. They can use the information from the attribute chart to help them fill this out. And the Venn diagram can be adapted to the different stages of language acquisition the same way that you adapted the attribute chart, and to have students verbally describe their charts. It doesn't take long for students to become familiar with the Venn diagram because so many teachers use this strategy. It is important to teach students attribute charts first so that they can have the language to fill in the Venn diagram.
Another strategy identified in the book is the comparison matrix. When using the comparison matrix, you initially give students familiar items to compare and then gradually add to the list of characteristics. For pre-production students, students can draw pictures and build vocabulary through word selection. For early production students, teachers would model with sentence starters. For example, the apple, orange, and banana are the same or different because. For speech emergence students, teachers help students to expand sentences by turning short disjointed sentences into compound sentences by using and because while talking and writing. And for intermediate and advanced fluency students, you'd have them write about similarities and differences with teacher feedback using compound sentences and more academic language.
Okay, now we want you to think back to the beginning of our presentation. Think back to the strategy we asked you to identify at the beginning. Is this a strategy we discussed? If so, how can you adapt it for the different stages of language acquisition in your setting? If it's not, is there a way you can adapt your strategy based off of the ideas covered in our presentation to meet the needs of your students at different stages of language acquisition in your setting? Please respond in the comments.
Thank you.
Thanks.